What will keep Bitcoin from devolving into all of the same problems as the US dollar? The answer is Bitcoin was architected from literally day one to make sure that doesn't happen. So the way the US dollar works, the amount of US dollars sloshing around in the economy is controlled by the central bank. And in the United States, that central bank is called the Federal Reserve, even though it's not federal and it has no reserves. So like everything in government, it usually does the opposite of what the name says. So the Inflation Reduction Act increased inflation. And the Federal Reserve is not federal and it has no reserves. So that is the, just like if there's a Ministry of Truth, you can be assured that its job is to spread lies. That is the way government works. Okay, so when Bitcoin was invented back in 2009 and was released, it was specifically architected to make sure that people could not make more than 21 million of the Bitcoin. And then the Bitcoin are divisible below that into, you can buy, a fraction of a Bitcoin, but the total number of Bitcoin is capped at 21 million. And the way that that is guaranteed is because all of the computers on the Bitcoin network, of which there is more than 100,000 computers around the world, including running on satellites, running on servers, every continent, every country, there's just Bitcoin nodes. They're called nodes, N-O-D-E-S, Bitcoin nodes. I myself run 2 Bitcoin nodes. They cost about $400. So if you want to run a Bitcoin node, it's about $400. There's no reason for you to run one though, because there's so many Bitcoin nodes running already that there's really no benefit you get because a gazillion people are already running nodes. And there's technically infinitely more than would be required to guarantee Bitcoin did not go off the rails. But everybody who runs a Bitcoin node has a veto power over changes to the rule set of Bitcoin. So the most important rule of Bitcoin, literally the reason it was invented, was to guarantee that there would never be more than 21 million, which is the opposite of the US dollar. The US dollar is guaranteed to constantly lose purchasing power because that's the way it's designed. Even the Federal Reserve says they're trying to make it lose between 2 and 3% per year, and often the US dollar actually loses more like 4% to 9% every year. Okay, so how does Bitcoin make sure that there's no more than 21 million? Well, the answer is all of the computers that run the Bitcoin software, of which there are more than 100,000, have a veto over changes to the rules. So if any of those computers tries to change the rules to increase the number of Bitcoin, even by one sole solitary Bitcoin, it would immediately be kicked off the network, and which would mean it's all by its lonesome self. For example, the internet runs on a protocol called TCP/IP, and the internet has run on that protocol for many, many, many decades since pretty much the invention of the internet, or at least its modern, incarnation. And the TCP/IP protocol determines how computers talk to each other. And if you change the protocol so that your computer is speaking a different language, you are no longer on the internet. You are sitting all by yourself speaking a protocol that only you understand, and your computer is talking to itself. Well, the same thing happens on the Bitcoin network. If someone tries to change the protocol rules of Bitcoin, suddenly they're not on the Bitcoin network anymore, because none of the other computers on the Bitcoin network will talk to that computer anymore. So all of the more than 100,000 Bitcoin computers are all constantly talking to each other, and they're all programmed to cut out and exclude and ignore anyone that changes anything about the protocol of how Bitcoin works. So the last time that this actually happened, it's never happened related to the total amount of Bitcoin. Literally, there's never been, recommending that there ever be more than 21 million Bitcoin ever in circulation is you just get kicked out of the room. It's just the dumbest idea ever. It's the complete antithesis of the whole point it was built. It'd be the equivalent of walking into a barn raising ceremony and recommending, hey, what if we just burned it all down? It's we're all here to build a barn. Why on earth would we set it on fire? So it's the same thing. You're never going to get support. In addition, every one of those more than 100,000 computers can veto that change. So in order to get a change through to increase the number of Bitcoin, even by a one sole solitary Bitcoin, every single person who runs a Bitcoin node would have to agree. And guess what? The whole reason they run a Bitcoin node is to guarantee that that never happens. people run Bitcoin nodes specifically to give themselves a veto to make sure that the rules never change. That's why I run a Bitcoin node. I run a Bitcoin node so that there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. Now, there's, again, more than 100,000 nodes out there, and the vast majority are run by hardcore Bitcoiners like me, so it's not like they even need my veto power. But it's like showing up and, hey, why not? Why not have one more person that can veto a rule change? So the last time someone changed anything about the rules that created a kerfuffle was back in 2017. There was a huge debate and discussion about a very, very technical aspect of Bitcoin, which determined how big your hard drive had to be if you wanted to keep a copy of every Bitcoin transaction that had ever happened throughout all of time. Again, this had nothing to do about whether there would be 21 million. There was no discussion whatsoever about whether there would be 21 million Bitcoin. That is set in stone. That will never change. That is inherent to the Bitcoin protocol. But it was this very technical discussion about how big your hard drive should have to be. And some people wanted it to be larger so that the Bitcoin network would have slightly higher throughput. And other people were interested in decentralization, where for the rest of eternity, you could walk into Best Buy, buy a cheap computer, and run the entire Bitcoin blockchain and the entire network on your personal computer without having to have a large hard drive. Anyway, the purists of that won the battle. The people who wanted the smallest hard drives that anyone could run on their computer at home without having to get a hard drive upgrade, they won. And so what happened was, on the day that the people who wanted that change decided that they were going to make that change, everyone who didn't want that change, which was the vast majority of people, they just didn't upgrade their software to the software that had the change that the people wanted. And because the Bitcoin network software is open source, meaning anyone in the world can look at the computer code of the Bitcoin software, they didn't run that version of the software. It was just a different version. It wasn't the version of the software that has all the rules that everybody else wanted to run. And so on that day, the people that were in favor of the change changed their Bitcoin nodes to run a different piece of software, and they got themselves kicked off the network. So if you're wondering, could this ever happen? It's like, yeah, and you just get kicked off the network. So what happened to all those computers that were running the Bitcoin software that had this tiny little rule change that had to do with the size of the hard drive that it took to hold the Bitcoin blockchain? The answer is they all got kicked off the network, and they had to name their protocol something. And they wanted it to be Bitcoin, even though it wasn't, so they called it Bitcoin Cash. And the ticker symbol is BCH. So Bitcoin Cash, BCH. So what has happened to Bitcoin Cash from 2017 to the present? Well, first off, it marched downward. Like all stupid crypto things that are not Bitcoin, it marched down and down and down. And now it is worth less than 1%. First of all, it lost 99% of its value. So 99% of the value of that protocol, of that change, of that token, 99% of it went away. And then in the last probably, year, it lost another half. So it is down to less than 1/2 of 1% of what it was previously. Literally, it lost 199/200ths of its value because they all got kicked off the network. So how do we know that the Bitcoin will not be changed and screwed up and go the way of the U.S. dollar? The answer is because the U.S. dollar is controlled by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and really by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which means Jerome Powell is basically the one guy that decides how many U.S. dollars are sloshing around in the economy. So that's why Bitcoin will not go that way. The U.S. dollar is controlled effectively by one person, the Federal Reserve chairman, which is Jerome Powell. The Bitcoin, on the other hand, Bitcoin is controlled by more than 100,000 people, any one of which has a veto power, all of which have a veto power over any changes. So if somebody tries to change Bitcoin to make it more like the US dollar, I'm not going to run that software on my Bitcoin node. And neither will 99.999% of those 100,000 people that run the Bitcoin software, because they all run the Bitcoin software because they all don't want it to become the US dollar. So absolutely positively, the thing that doesn't need to change about Bitcoin is that there will never be more than 21 million. And I can absolutely assure you that will never change about Bitcoin, because the entire reason people run Bitcoin nodes, and the entire reason there's more than 100,000 of those nodes running in the world, is that more than 100,000 people have a veto over any changes. And if somebody even started talking about changing the total supply of Bitcoin to a number more than more than 21 million, a bunch more people would start running the Bitcoin software so that they too had vetoes over all of it. And again, it only takes one person, literally one person in the entire planet, or in the satellites in space, because Bitcoin nodes run on satellites in space as well. Even if one of them did not change the software over to make a change, then Bitcoin, the way it is now with 21 million, continues on forever. And that is what will actually happen. So Bitcoin will never go the way of the US dollar, and it is the incredible ingenuity, human ingenuity, that enables that to happen, and which is why Bitcoin is so powerful and so amazing. So have a great day, everyone, in a world where there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. Thanks.